welcome back to the TRIAX Performance channel for another episode of the TRIAX Tute series. For those of you new to the channel, my name is Damon Bednarski and I form 1/3 of the TRIAX Performance team alongside Rob and Sean. If you wish to contact me, you can reach me at Damon Bednarski on Twitter or via any of the TRIAX social media accounts, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Rob's favourite, the TikTok. In today's episode, we're going to cover a question that I get asked a lot by athletes and clients, and that is, what is RPE and what is it used for? Rating of Perceived Exertion, otherwise known as RPE, is a scale created by Swedish researcher Gunnar Borg to rate and monitor the intensity of exercise. The idea behind the RPE scale is to obtain a subjective measure from your athlete or client to understand how difficult or how intense they believe they were working during the session. This value can then be used to complement your objective measures that you have from technology such as GPS and other monitoring systems to determine how hard they believe they were working compared to how hard the data shows they actually were working during the session. Borg's RPE scale was originally designed as a 14-point scale from 6 to 20, with 6 being no to minimal exertion and 20 being maximal exertion. As you might imagine, a 14-point scale starting at 6 and ending at 20 is not the easiest thing to understand and certainly not the easiest thing to explain to an athlete or client. So since then, there's been modifications to the scale with the introduction of a 0 to 10 and a 0 to 100 scale. The most common of these scales is the 0 to 10 scale, which can be seen on screen. While you might find slight variations in the terminology used for each point on the scale, the premise remains the same. Each level is progressively more difficult. The scale we have included is as follows. 0 equals resting / not active. 1 is very easy. 2, easy. 3, moderate. 4, kind of hard. 5 and 6 are hard, with 6 being the upper end of hard. 7 and 8 are very hard, with 8 being the upper end. 9 is very, very hard, and 10, the final number, is maximal. Maximal is defined as something that you couldn't work any harder at. So for example, a time trial or a maximal effort such as a VO2 max test. So when can we use the RPE scale? Most commonly, the RPE scale is used during aerobic fitness training, as it can provide a value of perceived intensity during aerobic exercise, and it matches up well with heart rate data, which has been shown in research. So we can get a good subjective measure of how intensely an athlete thinks they're working, and then we can match this up with our prescribed training to see whether or not we're actually meeting our training goals. RPE has also been shown to be a reliable measure of workload during aerobic fitness training. So to estimate workload using the RPE system, which is how you might commonly see it used, is to collect a number off an athlete from 0 to 10 and then multiply this by the session duration. What this will give you is an arbitrary measure of load for that training session. So for example, if an athlete gives you a score of 6 and they were active for 20 minutes, their load for that session would be 120. We can then use this measure to see over a long term how much workload they've been doing, and we can also use this to match up and have a look at objective data that we've collected. So if you've got a GPS unit or other technology that measures intensity of a training session objectively, we can match up and have a look and see how our prescribed training matches up with the actual data that they've got from their GPS unit, and then also use a subjective measure from the athlete through the RPE to see how hard they thought they were working at the intensity that they were actually working. And this can give us a good measure to see how athletes respond to training, and it can also be combined with other factors. So if an athlete's fatigued, haven't had enough sleep, their diet's not right, they might have actually seen a session that might have been a 5 out of 10 as an 8 out of 10. And what we can do is adjust an athlete's training load later in the week based on that, because that session was really hard for them, even though in our prescribed load it wasn't a hard session. And so we can really use that to adapt our training to match the athlete and how they're feeling. So this is why a subjective measure is really important, because rather than just prescribing load based on what we actually do through the GPS, we're also getting some feedback from the athlete to cater to their needs and their training based on how they feel. One thing I do want to add as well about RPE is particularly when doing it with aerobic fitness training, is give your athletes 5 or so minutes after a session before asking them for the value. Because if you ask them straight away when they're tired, they're fatigued, they're probably going to give you a high value because they're out of breath. You've asked them straight after a session. So what you should do is give them 5 to 10 minutes after the session and then ask them how hard they thought the session was. Then they can give you a more overall value of the session rather than one when they're feeling fatigued. What I also find is something that's quite common is if you ask players in front of each other, what they will do is they will just go, oh yeah, Bob said 5 or John said 6, I'm just going to say what they said. Try to make it as anonymous as possible. So if you can have a one-on-one conversation with your athletes, get your value that way. Otherwise, what you'll find is it's a herd mentality and everyone will give the same value, and it won't be respective of their individual athlete. They'll just give you the arbitrary value that everyone in the group has. Something that's also becoming a little bit more popular these days with RPE is using RPE in the gym for resistance training. So RPE in the gym is a little bit different to the aerobic fitness out on the field. So it's more in between sets that we're using the RPE value, and it's a gauge of how difficult that set was and how many reps we have in reserve essentially. So the scale on screen that you can see here explains how the reps in reserve system works when we're using an RPE system. Unlike the RPE scale for aerobic training, which is generally collected after the entire session, the reps in reserve RPE scale is used after each set to gauge an athlete's level of fatigue. So starting from the top, a rating of 1 to 2 indicates that the load of your lift required little to no effort and that you could easily increase your load for the next set while maintaining the same or more reps. You would expect this sort of rating for a warm-up set and would want to limit the amount of training at this RPE if you wish to see improvements. For 3 and 4, this would indicate that the load of your lift required some effort, but you could increase the load for your next set by a moderate to large amount, so approximately 10%, while maintaining the same number of reps without fatigue. For optimal gains in hypertrophy, strength and power, you should be aiming for your sets to be a 5 or higher on the RPE scale. So what does a 5 and 6 indicate? This would indicate that you could perform 4 to 6 more reps at this load before fatiguing or failure. So a small to moderate increase of approximately 5% in your load could be applied for the next set. 7 on the scale indicates that you could perform a maximum of 3 more reps at this load before fatiguing or failure, and a small increase, so less than 5% in load, could be applied for the next set. For 8, this would indicate that you could perform a maximum of 2 reps at this load before fatiguing or failure, and you might maintain the same or add a very small amount for the next set. So this again would be less than 5%. For 9 and 10, this indicates that you are at or near your maximum and that you could perform 1 or no more reps in your next set. Sessions in which you're aiming to train for maximal strength should aim to be at this magnitude on the reps and reserve scale. As you can see, using this scale is a really good guide to determine when you need to increase your volume. So if we've got 4 or 5 reps in reserve based on our RPE rating on the scale, what we can do is increase the intensity for the next set. Similarly to aerobic fitness and using RPE, it's a really good way for an athlete to internally determine how they're feeling. So we can prescribe a training session, but it doesn't account for external factors, as I said, so sleep, fatigue, diet, all of these things. So if an athlete rocks up to a training session and they're doing something that would normally be a 4 on the RPE scale for them, but it actually feels like a 6 or a 7, what we can do is just adapt that training session for them, and they can do less reps the next set, or they'll maintain their load, so the weight on the bar for that exercise, and then just progress through the session that way. If they're feeling really good and it's easier than what they thought, then we can obviously increase the load for that session. So this is where it's really useful in resistance training, is it can be used as a guide to either maintain our load or increase the load based how the athlete's feeling, rather than just going off what we've got on the paper and saying, yes, we have to do 6 reps at our 5RM, which might be 100 kilos for a squat, where in reality that day we're feeling quite fatigued, and for us 80 kilos is actually our 5RM. So we use the rating of perceived exertion to determine how our session's going to progress. When using the reps in reserve scale, to ensure you continue to progress your training, you need to apply progressive overload. So what does this mean? In short, you either increase your load or reduce your reps in reserve each week. An example of this, start week 1 at 4 reps in reserve, week 2 with 3 reps in reserve, week 3 with 2 reps in reserve, and so on until you get to week 5 with 0 reps in reserve during your session. This block of progressively increasing training would then be followed by a deload week, where the volume and/or intensity of training are reduced to approximately 50 to 70%, and then we would restart the cycle again, but this time your 4 reps in reserve load should hopefully be greater, and with each week progressing, your load would increase again. So eventually your reps in reserve at 0, again, the load will have increased. I hope that clears up any questions you have about the RPE scale. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments section or contact us directly on the TRIAX socials.